Hey everyone, I'm Supersonic7C, and welcome to Syntax Error, the show where I analyze topics that relate to game design and try to teach viewers how to develop their games. Today I'll be talking about game feel, and more specifically how the visual aspect of gameplay affects game feel. Popularized by Steve Swank's book, this term, which is also sometimes known as game juice or audio-visual feedback, refers to the tangible sensation players feel thanks to feedback created by several different aspects of video games and the hardware used to play them. The better these stimulants are, the better the game feel will be, and by extension, the better the gameplay will feel to play. In theory, if the game feel is good enough, the gameplay stripped down to its core mechanics should still be enjoyable to interact with. Good game feel is created differently in every game, and there are countless tips and tricks that developers can add into their gameplay to improve the quality of game feel, but it always comes down to finding ways to make gameplay satisfying or engaging. During gameplay, anything that rewards the player by appealing to them or to their senses makes the gameplay more satisfying, and anything that interests the player or immerses them by giving players a sense of realism makes the gameplay more engaging. It's very important for every game to have good game feel because without it, even gameplay that's designed in a very entertaining or enjoyable way can become boring and annoying. Preferably, gameplay should always be both satisfying and engaging to guarantee the creation of good game feel, but that can be very difficult to pull off for some games. Luckily, if the gameplay is lacking on one front, good game feel can still be created by compensating and making sure the gameplay is at least very satisfying or very engaging. So what aspects contribute to game feel and give players feedback that helps make the gameplay satisfying or engaging? There's some debate over the answer to this question, but I personally believe there are 4 aspects that affect game feel: visuals, audio, controls, and finally, how the gameplay itself is designed. If all of these aspects help the gameplay become satisfying or engaging while working in harmony, good game feel is usually achieved. Now, you may be wondering why this all sounds a bit familiar. Well, that's probably because this is actually a remake of a Syntax Error episode I've already released in the past. No, not that one. That one. Yeah, the one that was an hour and 20 minutes long. For a few reasons, most notably its length, and because it can be a pretty daunting task to make sure even one of these 4 aspects helps create good game feel, I've decided to split up the original episode, expand a bit on every segment, and cover each aspect in its own episode. Thus, I'll be covering the entire topic of game feel over the span of a mini-series that's comprised of the next handful of episodes. So, without further exposition, let's move on to the topic of this episode. Arguably, the most important aspect that affects game feel is the game's visuals. Now, when I say visuals, I don't mean graphics. While not having appealing, high-resolution graphics that all artistically fit together can negatively affect the overall game feel, having higher quality or more realistic graphics normally don't improve game feel in any way. Also, when it comes to visuals in general, not including visual cues like reflections, shadows, or a body for first-person playable characters, and not including an intuitive heads-up display can make the gameplay less immersive, and therefore, less engaging. Additionally, if the visuals confuse players by not clearly conveying objects or whatever is happening on the screen, the game feel can be ruined. But there are other, more specific ways visuals can improve game feel or hinder it if they're poorly executed. Animations are extremely important, and without them, the gameplay can feel stiff, visually uninteresting, and lifeless. Animations can also help immerse and satisfy players, but if they're poor quality, they can also cause the entire game to feel awful, or at the very least, jarring to play. To avoid poor quality animations, make sure they clearly convey whatever action is being performed, they fit the tone of the action, and above all else, make sure they aren't poorly animated. How do you avoid animating poorly? Well, sadly, the answer to that question is a long one. So long, in fact, that it'll have to be a topic for another episode that's not part of this mini-series. For now, I'll just be focusing on the other, more specific ways animations can improve game feel, like by having a good sense of weight and power. Creating a sense of weight is a bit self-explanatory. Basically, just have animations reflect the physical properties of the objects involved using your own knowledge of them. These properties can include anything from how heavy, sturdy, and dense an object is, to how it absorbs impact or reacts to elements like liquid, gases, or even wind. For example, a leaf being blown into a body of water may quickly move with the wind, but then gently fall into the water and only make a small ripple before staying afloat on its surface. Creating a sense of power is far less self-explanatory. To break it down and hopefully make the process simpler, divide the action you're animating into 3 segments: the build-up, the movement, and the reaction. If I were to divide up the action of punching someone, the build-up would be the attacker making a fist and pulling their arm back, the movement would be the arm extending and contacting the other person, and the reaction would be the person who got hit recoiling while the attacker's fist lingers in the air or moved with the other person. Changing the animation's timing or speed it takes to complete each of these segments can be referred to as tweening or easing, and it allows the animation to convey different senses of power and weight. A good way to make an action feel powerful is by having a relatively long build-up, a quick movement, and finally, a long reaction. In other words, favor the result of the action rather than the action itself. On the other hand, a good way to make an action feel weak is by having a relatively long build-up, a movement that takes just about as long as the build-up, and a quick reaction. When it comes to conveying weight, changing the timing in relation to gravity can help objects feel lighter or heavier. For example, light objects normally take a while to fall to the ground, while heavy objects normally take a while to be lifted. As long as they're brief, including freeze frames can also help improve the player's sense of satisfaction. Freeze frames are created by pausing and holding a frame of an animation segment. Most of the time, this comes in the form of holding the first or last frame in an animation segment to emphasize whatever action is being performed. The game Pac-Man Championship Edition 2 uses freeze frames to make its gameplay far more satisfying. Whenever the player is about to eat a chain of ghosts, Pac-Man and the ghosts freeze right before the player automatically continues to eat the entire chain. This freezing could get annoying if it was dragged out for too long or if it occurred too often, but because it's only repeated when players start to eat ghosts, and because it only lasts for less than a second, it creates a great sense of impact and satisfaction. In addition to pausing frames, you can also change how the animations feel by experimenting with the number of animation frames per second that are in each segment. For instance, having a large amount of frames in the build-up, a relatively small number of frames in the movement, and only a few frames for the reaction often makes animations seem fast and powerful. Remember though, the less frames are in an animation, the quicker that animation needs to be. Having a small amount of frames for a slow animation will almost always end up looking very choppy. Also, keep in mind that the frames of animations and speeds of actions don't always need to line up with reality. While including realistic build-up animations for non-playable characters like enemies works great and makes the gameplay more fair by allowing the player to telegraph their movements long before an action is performed, realism will most likely have to be ignored entirely for most actions performed by the player. This is because the more time that passes between the input of a command and the execution of the action, the more sluggish the gameplay will feel. A very common example of this is how most games make the build-up for jumping practically non-existent and don't include any animation for characters bending their knees. Even though this defies physics and doesn't make any sense in most situations, realism is sacrificed to prevent the game from feeling far less responsive. Now, it is possible to include realistic build-up animations for the playable character without destroying the game feel if the entire game is designed around that action being slower and delayed, but this can be somewhat risky. There's still a chance that adhering to reality will cause the gameplay to feel slower and the game feel to be worse for some players, no matter what. Speaking of realism though, exaggerating reality visually can also help improve game feel. This can be done by including animations that intentionally go off model and warp proportions during certain movements. The most common form of these animations is referred to as squash and stretch animations. These are cartoony looking animations that distort proportions in an exaggerated way to simulate a sort of momentum. Animating the proportions of an object or character squashing is a great way to convey a sense of impact, and animating them stretching is a great way to show speed. Lethal League is a fast-paced competitive multiplayer game about striking opponents with a ball. It uses squash and stretch animations to do this very thing and give its ball a great sense of impact and speed, which makes it far more satisfying to hit and engaging to watch. Notice that whenever the ball squashes when hitting an object or stretches when picking up speed, its mass and volume always stays roughly the same. By that, I mean the ball never seems to grow or shrink, and when one side is compressed or extended, the other sides react accordingly. For example, when the ball stretches out, it also gets thinner, and when the ball squashes down, it widens. I highly advise always adhering to this rule when using squash and stretch animations unless you're willing to risk the game feel by having it look like the object is breaking the laws of physics and gaining length or width. The next type of animation that exaggerates visuals is called smear animations. Similar to stretch animations, smear animations or smear frames are used to give a satisfying sense of speed by replicating motion blur. Unlike stretch frames, which imply the object is physically stretching thanks to momentum, these animations do not have to compensate widths or heights in order to keep roughly the same mass and volume. In fact, because smear animations are simply meant to be motion blur, it will most likely look very odd and horribly unrealistic if this is done. Another way to simulate motion blur is to create animations that include duplicates of the moving object. This is what's sometimes called multiples, but if you're anything like me, you've probably heard it referred to as an afterimage animation. In addition to giving the player a satisfying sense of speed, these can also be used to convey a sense of power or skill, but only if they're on screen long enough for the players to notice them. Additionally, these animations can also make gameplay more engaging simply because they look visually interesting in motion. When including any of these exaggerated animation effects, remember that they're normally meant for 2D animations. If you're making a game with 3D animations and want to include them, prepare to spend far more time and resources on creating these effects. If you don't, they'll most likely come across as visual glitches to most players who notice them, and fail to improve the game feel in any way. Fair warning though, they may look like visual glitches regardless to some players who aren't used to seeing these techniques in 3D animations. Another type of animation that often improves game feel but can take large amounts of time and effort to implement are what I call buffer animations, or buffers for short. These are animations that are included between two other animations to make the transition between them smoother or more natural. In games, it's very common for playable characters to have dozens of unique animations for specific gameplay actions. Unlike most animated movies or shows, which usually don't reuse animations and can create transitions between all actions thanks to animators knowing exactly what will happen and when it will happen, animations that are shown during gameplay are meant to be reused, and each animation is separated from the others so that they can be played in any order at any time. This means the playable character often looks as if it's snapping between different movements in the blink of an eye. Luckily, this usually goes unnoticed by many players, but it becomes far more noticeable when characters go from something like a calm idle animation to instantly sprinting across the screen to suddenly standing still and punching before returning to the calm idle animation. Some developers try fixing this by having all animations start and end with the same pose, or by creating procedural animations using programming. But both of these methods normally don't look good and cause the animations to feel disjointed from one another. Manually creating buffer animations, on the other hand, can be used to include transitions between all of those actions while also preventing immersion from being broken and making the gameplay feel smoother. Buffer animations are included in a lot of games. For example, most games include animations for the characters starting to run from their idle animation, and animations of them returning to their idle animation by screeching to a halt after running. But that's the thing, almost all buffer animations are for transitions to or from idle animations. Very few games include them for transitions between two actions, like going from running to punching or from one attack to another. Now, I know what you may be thinking. It makes sense to not include buffer animations for these actions and to make sure they're as snappy as possible. After all, I said it myself, the more time it takes to complete an action, the worse gameplay can feel, but this issue can be avoided if the buffer animations are taken into account and the total time it takes to complete each action isn't long enough to feel sluggish. Batman Arkham Asylum includes multiple buffer animations for combat, which could easily cause the gameplay to feel sluggish and annoying. Instead, because all the buffer animations are very quick and snappy, it helps everything have a satisfying sense of flow to it in addition to it looking far more natural and engaging. Other than this, buffer animations can also be used to include some realism and make the gameplay seem more natural by implying the character performing them is in a different mental state. In most games, the idle animation is usually a very calm or neutral pose. Because of this, it can sometimes look very odd to have the character go from energetic fighting to standing in a calm, neutral position in mere seconds. To avoid this, the game Jack and Daxter includes a buffer animation that serves as an alternate idle animation. When the player stands still, the default calm one plays, but after they've just attacked, a more energetic idle animation plays before transitioning back to the calm idle animation after a few seconds. This adds some realism to the characters and helps the player stay immersed while also making the gameplay look smoother and more visually interesting. Be careful when it comes to including buffer animations though. While it would be nice to have buffer animations for every combination of two actions, animations cost time and resources, so make sure to not go overboard by including too many of them. Try to stick to the essentials at first, like the ones that lead to and from the idle animation. Then add any extra buffer animations that you can afford for frequently repeated action combinations. The same goes for creating alternate versions of animations, regardless of whether or not they're used as a buffer. Yeah, they can also improve game feel by helping the gameplay stay immersive and interesting, but they can also burn through resources. So just like with buffer animations, I recommend only including alternate animations if an action is heavily and frequently repeated during gameplay. Now, creating animations aren't the only visual way to improve game feel. Visual effects can be used as well. These are visuals that can be created with animations, but are normally pulled off at least in part using programming in order to avoid large amounts of work. Most of the time, visual effects are used to simulate the way something looks or acts in reality in order to avoid something feeling wrong or off. These effects can come in countless forms. Particle effects are a common visual effect that improves game feel by helping certain objects look more realistic and visually interesting. Particle effects are used to create things like embers rising from a fire, falling snow, bits of debris exploding from a barrel, bugs flying around a light source, energy tailing behind a magical orb, and smoke dispersing from an explosion. All of these could be created by animating them manually, but this would be a large amount of work, especially if the object needs to move around and the particles need to be affected by wind or momentum. This task becomes incredibly less time-consuming if the particles themselves are the only thing animated, and their movements are pulled off by programming physics. Artificial motion blur is another common visual effect that's meant to recreate what humans and cameras see when an object moves by very quickly without spending large amounts of time creating multiples or smear animations. This is included in games for many reasons. Some developers of horror games include artificial motion blur because they believe it'll help their game become scarier. Other developers include it to help their games look more cinematic or more visually interesting, but it can also be used with the intention of making the game more immersive and realistic. If this worked as intended, artificial motion blur could help the gameplay become both satisfying and engaging. But sadly, most players, myself included, just find this effect to be nauseating and an eyesore. Don't get me wrong, it can work if it's used in moderation and if it doesn't blur the objects on screen past the point of recognition, but it's also somewhat redundant since the human eye should naturally create its own motion blur if the objects are moving by fast enough. Regardless, if you do plan on adding this visual effect, make sure it's optional and that it can be easily turned off at any point, because not only does it make people sick, it often eats up a large amount of the computer's resources, which can easily cause the game to lag or even crash on some machines. Another visual effect that is much more likely to add some satisfaction and impact to the gameplay while also making it more engaging is normally referred to as slow motion. This effect usually takes control away from the player and intentionally slows down one or all of the visuals to put more emphasis on the action in an attempt to make it more interesting and rewarding. In the past few years, this effect has become something of a trend or cliche to include in games. It's popped up so much that some people believe slow motion should never be used and feel it's a cheap or lazy substitute meant to trick players into thinking an action in a game has good game feel. While I personally think that's a bit extreme and don't advocate banning any visual effect entirely, I do believe that slow motion doesn't need to be included in every game, and that it can often feel tacked on or useless, but that doesn't mean it can't be useful. When including slow motion, it needs to be used in moderation. It is great for making an action more satisfying and engaging, but it usually only works once or twice before quickly outstaying its welcome. Many games take control away from the player and slow down the gameplay whenever they complete certain tasks or perform a powerful move. This may feel satisfying the first time, but if it's repeated too often, it'll most likely lose its charm, become annoying, and feel like the game is dragging itself out. Flashing is another visual effect that can add to the player's sense of satisfaction. Flashing refers to when the entire screen or an object suddenly changes in some way for a split second. The most common form of this is when an enemy flashes when hit. Flashing can also be used to describe when the entire screen flashes to signify a powerful attack, or when an object quickly flashes right before it explodes or shatters. All of these forms of flashing can give players a satisfying sense of impact or power, while also helping to inform players that they've definitely affected the object in question, which helps avoid confusing the player. Although, if flashing is used too often, it can become annoying or harsh on the eyes. If you include any type of flashing in your game, no matter how small or infrequent, I'd make sure it can be turned off at any point, but definitely make sure to include an epilepsy warning beforehand to prevent your players from being hurt and to prevent yourself from possibly falling into legal trouble. So far, all of the visual effects I've mentioned have been somewhat simple in one way or another. Not all visual effects are like this. Parallax scrolling is a fairly complex example of a visual effect that's meant to simulate what's called relative motion in reality. This term, which is also referred to as motion parallax, describes the visual depth cue humans see when observing objects that move past us. You may have noticed motion parallax if you've ever looked out the window in a moving vehicle and noticed that objects closer to you seem to move fairly quickly and sometimes seem to move so fast that they're a blur, while objects much farther away seem to move far slower in comparison. How does this make sense? Assuming the objects are stationary, then the only thing moving is you, and thus everything should seem to be moving away at your speed. So why do we see motion parallax? Well, everyone has a field of vision that increases the farther away it is from their eyes, which basically means you can see less of an area the closer it is to your eyes. To see what I mean, look straight ahead and place your open hands next to the sides of your head, as if you were about to cover your ears. Make sure they're far enough back and in a spot where you can't see them at all. Now, while continuing to look straight and without moving your head, slowly move your hands forward without lowering or elevating them. This should allow you to see your hands gradually come into your field of view. An alternate way to test this is by looking at an area that's being obscured by an object, like the area behind a computer monitor or behind a pillar. Make sure the object has some amount of distance between itself and the area behind it, because the farther the distance, the more noticeable the results will be. Then, look forward and point your head at the object so it's in the middle of your vision. Once you've done this, look around the object by only moving your eyes and take note of how much of the area you can see behind it. Now, slowly lean your head closer towards the object or move the object closer to you without moving it or your head in any other direction. The closer you move towards the object, the less you should see of the area behind it. So how does our field of vision, which is also called our field of view, or our FOV for short, create motion parallax in reality? Well, like I said, the farther away your FOV gets from your eyes, the bigger it is. To visualize it, think of your FOV like a cone with the tip located at your eye and the base located as far as you can see. Now, if there were two objects moving through your FOV at the exact same speed and at roughly the same distance from your eye, they would appear to move past you at exactly the same speed, and you wouldn't notice any motion parallax. Although, if the two objects are moving at the exact same speed but are at noticeably different distances from your eye, say in the foreground and the background of your vision, the foreground object, which is closer, will enter your FOV after the background object. This is because that object is farther away, and the further something is from your eye, the more room there is for that object to be seen. Then the foreground object will exit your FOV before the background object for the same reason, thus causing motion parallax, which makes it seem to move by faster and sometimes cause it to be blurred if it enters and exits your FOV very quickly. To clarify, motion parallax won't only be seen for two objects on two different layers. It'll be seen no matter how many objects or layers there are. Assuming all objects are stationary, the closest object will always seem to move the fastest, while the next farthest object will always seem to move slower, and the object farther than that will always seem to move even slower, and so on until the farthest object, which will always seem to move the slowest. When both you and the objects aren't stationary, objects moving in the opposite direction of you seem to move faster in relation to its speed, and objects moving in the same direction of you appear to move slower in relation to its speed, as long as it's not moving at roughly the same speed as you. If both you and the object are moving at roughly the same speed and in the same direction, it will stay at roughly the same position in your FOV. If the distance between your FOV and the object was changing as you moved past each other, this would cause the object to either appear to decrease speed as it was moving farther away, or appear to increase speed as it was getting closer. This is all well and good, but how is motion parallax created in video games? Luckily, in games with realistically proportioned three-dimensional areas, motion parallax should still be seen without any extra work, regardless of the camera angle. Although, for two-dimensional games, or any game without realistically proportioned 3D areas, motion parallax usually won't be correctly seen, but there is a way to include it. Parallax scrolling simulates motion parallax in games like this by manually creating layers of 3D objects or 2D images and moving the foreground, background, and midground layers at different speeds in relation to the movement of the playable character or the game's camera. This helps give players the illusion of depth, even if the game is using completely two-dimensional graphics. Parallax scrolling is very important because without depth, levels or areas can look flat, boring, and unrealistic, which can drastically hurt the game feel. Additionally, if the parallax scrolling doesn't look right, moving the playable character in general will most likely feel wrong and disjointed from the rest of the world because certain layers in the foreground, midground, or background aren't moving at roughly the correct speed. The first Sonic the Hedgehog is well known for its parallax scrolling. The background of every level has multiple layers that all move by at different speeds in relation to how fast the player is moving. For the most part, this looks great, but there are some exceptions. In the Starlight Zone levels, the stars may not seem like they're moving quite right. The reason this may look wrong is because according to motion parallax, when we see one layer of objects moving by faster than another layer of objects, this means the faster layer is closer to our eyes. In the game, the stars should move by the slowest, or maybe even not move at all since they're so far away, but because they move so quickly, it gives the impression that the stars are actually closer to the player than the buildings in the background, which move by at a much slower pace. Because of this, the player's sense of speed can feel all wrong in these levels, which makes the gameplay far less satisfying. Not only that, but this also creates an incorrect sense of depth, which makes the gameplay far less engaging as well. This is why it's very important to get the speeds of every layer right. So how do you do that? Well, assuming my research is accurate, there are formulas you can use to calculate the mathematically correct speed each layer should be moving based off their intended distance from the player. I could easily be wrong because, I'll admit, physics this complicated currently goes way over my head, but I believe these formulas are referred to as the motion over pursuit law. I would explain this law, but I honestly don't trust that I understand it, so I'll just include some links in the description of this video in case you want to try and take a crack at it. If you're like me and these formulas look as if they're in an alien language, don't worry, you don't need to use them. In fact, almost everyone just estimates how fast the layers should move through trial and error or by looking up reference videos. Just visualize how far away the layer should be and try different speeds relative to the movement speed of the player or camera while simulating the rules of motion parallax until it looks roughly the correct speed and distance. This may take a while at first, but once you get used to it, you'll be able to estimate the speeds of future layers much faster. When estimating, one other thing that needs to be kept in mind is that the implied speed of the playable character's movement animations must match up with the movement speed of the foreground, background, and midground layers. For example, if the playable character is shown to be running but the layers are moving too slow, this can give off the impression that the character lacks traction, or that the world is actually much larger than intended. On the other hand, if the playable character is shown to be walking but the layers are moving too fast, this can give off the impression that the world is much smaller than intended, or that the character is moving in slow motion and seemingly sliding across the ground. Either one of these examples can also warp the parallax scrolling and cause everything to seem too far away or too close. Depending on how your game is programmed, this may be a parallax scrolling issue or an animation issue, but if these don't match up, the game feel is pretty much guaranteed to be ruined. In addition to both animations and visual effects, there is another way game feel can be affected by visuals. Many gameplay cameras stay at the same angle and the same distance from the player for the entire game, but they don't always have to be so stiff and unchanging. As long as the camera doesn't change too often or too drastically, including what I call camera effects, like changing the camera angle or altering how the camera moves, can help the gameplay become far more engaging and sometimes even more satisfying. Shaking is a camera effect that can improve the gameplay in both of these ways. Usually, shaking refers to the camera moving up and down or side to side, but it can also refer to another visual effect similar to flashing or freeze frames. The visual effect is commonly used to give objects an elastic or rubbery feeling, but both the visual and camera effect are often used to accompany powerful things, like explosions or very strong attacks. In reality, something exploding or breaking apart can cause the ground or objects near it to shake, and when objects are struck by something powerful, it can cause them to shake as well. This is why shaking is associated with power, and why both effects help give players a sense of impact and realism. While the visual effect is normally only used on single objects and barely improves realism, using the camera effect to shake the entire screen is great for adding a sense of realism as well as a sense of power, especially in first-person games. Be careful though, shaking the entire camera can easily annoy players and make them motion sick. Countless first-person games include a form of camera shaking called head bobbing that's meant to increase immersion and allow players to feel as if they're really taking steps when they move. 99 out of 100 times, this backfires completely. In fact, PT is the only game I can think of where head bobbing actually worked and helped make the gameplay more engaging. The reason it normally backfires is because humans don't ever see head bobbing when they walk unless they're looking for it. Our brain purposefully edits it out of our sight and ignores it so we don't get motion sick. PT managed to pull it off by making sure it stayed so subtle that it could easily be ignored. If it's too prominent, adding head bobbing to games will usually just worsen the game feel and cause players to feel motion sickness. Tilting and rotating the camera is another visual effect that can create motion sickness if it's overused. Outlast is a first-person game that allows players to tilt the camera from side to side at will to peek around corners without being detected. It also gives players the ability to rotate the camera behind them while running so they can check to see if they're being chased. If this was automated, the camera changing suddenly could have gotten very annoying and caused players to feel sick or not be able to see where they were going, but because these movements are mapped to buttons, the gameplay becomes far more dynamic and visually interesting while also adding a sense of realism by helping the playable character look and feel more like an actual person. Although, tilting and rotating the camera is rarely used in this way. Most of the time, it's automated and it's used to focus the player on objects, characters, and certain events like something happening in the background or a hazard following the player. Doing this can help the gameplay feel more dynamic and engaging, but this effect can also be used to show scale. The game, Shadow of the Colossus, is all about fighting and climbing giant creatures called Colossus. If the Colossi didn't feel as if they were actually much larger than the playable character, the gameplay would take a massive hit and feel much less satisfying and engaging. One of the ways the game gives its Colossi a sense of scale is by having the camera tilt up when a Colossus is too tall to normally fit on the screen. Not only does this help the players keep track of what they're fighting, it also helps them feel as if they're actually being towered over by a giant creature. Additionally, Shadow of the Colossus uses another camera effect to give players a sense of scale and improve the overall game feel. The camera will often zoom in and out depending on what's happening on the screen. Zooming out is also used to track the colossi and give them scale, but zooming in is used to improve game feel as well by helping players focus on what they're looking at. This helps the gameplay become more engaging by emphasizing what the players are looking at when aiming their bow and emphasizing the movement or attacks of the smaller colossi. Other than this, zooming in and out is also used to make attacking the colossi more satisfying and engaging. Slightly zooming the camera in when attacking the colossi's weak point helps satisfy the player by allowing them to focus on the animation, and drastically zooming the camera out when the colossi has been defeated helps engage players by allowing them to fully see the consequences of their actions. Much like with all the other camera effects, zooming in and out can become annoying and sometimes create motion sickness, especially if the movement is a very quick, drastic change. Although, this too can be avoided in the same way by making sure the camera effect isn't repeated too often. By now, you probably understand why I said that the visual aspect of gameplay is arguably the most important aspect that affects game feel. Although, like all of the 4 aspects, it's extremely rare that visuals alone will be enough to create satisfying and engaging gameplay without being complemented by at least one other aspect. This can be pulled off in countless ways. Visuals often harmonize with the audio by syncing up with sound effects and by giving context to what the player is hearing. Visuals also often harmonize with the controls by giving the player visual feedback when they input a command. Additionally, visuals often harmonize with the gameplay design by giving context to actions and by helping create spectacle. I highly recommend harmonizing as many aspects as possible, but as long as the visuals harmonize with one or more of the other gameplay aspects, good game feel is usually achieved. On the next episode of Syntax Error, I'll be continuing this mini-series on game feel by talking about an aspect that goes hand in hand with the visual aspect, the audio aspect. I've been Supersonic 7CE, and hopefully I'll see you next time.